Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Along with freedom of speech, press, and the right to protest, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution spells out freedom of religion, the fundamental right to practice one's own faith, whatever it may be, as one of the key founding principles of the United States. In a sharp divergence from a Europe torn by religious wars, controlled by monarchs who claimed their right to rule was nothing less than divine, that their particular faith would be the faith of all within their borders, a foundational freedom of this new country was the principle that anyone could pray as they please, how they please, and to whom they please. This was both a radical embrace of the Enlightenment ideals that were circulating throughout Europe and their American colonies at the time, while at the same time a logical continuation of a colonial society that was home to an incredible religious diversity, though not one without conflict. Many of Britain's colonies in the United States were created explicitly as havens for religious refugees, sometimes for followers of specific minority denominations of Christianity. Christianity was far from the only religion present on America's shores at the eve of the country's founding. Significant Jewish and Muslim communities called the United States home dating well back to the colonial era, and countless other faiths have become part of the American story as the new country grew into a major destination for global immigration. Here, too, new faith practices have been born and spread around the world. Our status as a great nation of immigrants, our self-identity as hardworking, innovative, and creative, our staunch belief in individual freedom and inalienable rights, much of this we can trace back to these early Americans who fled persecution for the difference of their own beliefs, who created a new society where the old rules didn't have to apply. It has always been a struggle, though, to live up to our ideals. Petty prejudice has continued to rear its ugly head, and too often our basest instincts have gotten the better of us. Religious persecution is unfortunately no stranger to the land of the free. Yet all the same, we have continued throughout our history to be a country where those looking for the liberty to worship in peace have turned time and time again. 2 years ago, I released a project exploring the self-identified ancestry of the United States through maps, how the countries and ethnic groups Americans trace their ancestry to differ state by state and region by region. I hope this video will be complementary in many ways to my video on ancestry. Ancestry and religion are different in many ways. Namely, you cannot choose your ancestry, whereas the faith you practice is a personal choice. On top of that, while practically every American has ancestors from a number of different countries, people typically practice a single religion if they practice one at all. Because of this, unlike with ancestry, percentages in this video will roughly add up to 100%. At the same time, religious beliefs are often passed down through families, and the ways religions have arrived and spread throughout the United States are tied to both ethnicity and region. There are significant regional and statewide differences in the faiths Americans believe in. In this video, I'll explore these regional patterns and paint what I hope will be a fascinating portrait of the religious landscape of the United States. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. Today, America's religions, explored through maps. You all are usually pretty civil in the comments, so I'm not too worried, but because there is very little that's more personal to someone than their religious views, I hope everyone can enjoy this video while showing the same respect for someone else's beliefs that you would expect others to afford to you. Perhaps the most comprehensive and reputable data on religious statistics for both the United States and the world is published by the Pew Research Center. You can find it on their Religious Landscape Study, which I'll link in the description. In my ancestry video, I had to rely on self-reported statistics, which some of you had problems with, something I completely understand. With ancestry, self-reporting is imperfect, but pretty much the best data we have on such a large scale. With religion, though, self-identification is literally the only thing that matters, so it works great for our purposes. Pew got this data from taking a sample of 35,000 Americans from across the country. Because it's looking at a sample, you have to take into account that there could occasionally be some sampling error, especially when we're looking at faiths that have a much smaller presence in the country. This data is brand new. Part of the reason this video has taken so long for me to produce is that Pew actually updated their data for the first time in 10 years after I had already started writing this. So I had to go back to the drawing board and redo all the maps. America has changed more than you might expect in terms of its religious views since 2014. I kept the old map and will show it to you right here for comparison. Here's the old map, and here's the new map that we're going to be looking at in this video. Now, let's give you the rundown on how the Pew data works and how I organize this map. Pew includes data on all 50 states and also has further grouped states into 4 larger regions: the West, Midwest, Northeast, and South. The Religious Landscape Study does not have data on the 5 U.S. territories, but data on religion by country does, although it's less detailed, so I had to use other sites to fill in the gaps. They have metro area statistics on a number of larger cities across the country, which I definitely recommend checking out. The differences between various cities, as you might expect, can be pretty interesting. They break each subdivision, for most of our purposes we'll be looking at states, down into 3 main categories: the percentage practicing Christianity, the percentage practicing other non-Christian faiths, and the percent who they deem unaffiliated with any specific religion, such as those who are atheist, agnostic, or just simply marked nothing in particular. Non-Christian faiths are divided into 6 categories: followers of Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, and then categories for other world religions, which they don't give any examples of, but I'm guessing would include faiths like Sikhism or Baha'i, and one for other faiths. This they give a little more specificity on. It includes Native American religions, followers of New Age and pagan practices, and a category including everything from Unitarians to deists to those who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, or simply say, I have my own beliefs. Finally, they break Christians into 8 subcategories: 3 Protestant groups: Evangelical Protestants, Mainline Protestants, and historically Black Protestants, as well as a category for Catholics, one for Mormons, one for Orthodox Christians, and one for Jehovah's Witnesses, and a category for other Christians. Each of these you can then break down into tons of very specific denominations. In this video, I'll just be looking at some of these bigger picture groups, but if you really want to get into the weeds, by all means, go check out Pew's data to learn more. My map depicts the 2 largest of what I'm calling these subcategories among those who are religious in each state. The main color is the state's largest of these subcategories, whereas the thinner stripes on the map represent the state's 2nd largest faith. So, for example, although there are slightly more Protestants than Catholics in California, because Protestants are classified by Pew as either evangelical, mainline, or historically Black, while Catholics are just placed in one group, Catholics show up on this map as the largest of these subcategories in the state. Theoretically, this applies to the non-Christian faiths as well. In the 3 cases, Maryland, Delaware, and Florida, where there's a first place tie, the stripes are the same width. In the 4 cases with a second place tie, Ohio, Kentucky, Oregon, and New York, I depict on the main map whichever of the 2 groups had the larger proportion when the study was last done in 2014. If there were a state where Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism surpassed one of these subcategories of Christianity as one of the 2 largest in their percentage of the population, it would be included too. But spoiler alert, in every U.S. state, both the largest and 2nd largest faith practice are various branches of Christianity. When it's all said and done, only 5 different faith categories of the 14 Pew provides make it onto this map as either the largest or 2nd largest group in one of the 50 states. Catholics are represented by the color red, Mainline Protestants by the color blue, Evangelical Protestants by the color green, historically Black Protestants by the color purple, and Mormons by the color yellow. There are a few states, however, with significant proportions of people who practice other faiths beside Christianity, and I wanted to include them on the map somehow. If you look closely, you can see that I changed the texture of the 2nd color to a dotted pattern in the states and territories where more than 10% of the population practices a non-Christian faith: Washington, Oregon, Arizona, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and the Northern Mariana Islands. I also wanted to depict the relative strength of the presence of religion in each state. I did this by giving lighter shades of each respective color to states with higher proportions of people Pew describes as unaffiliated, and darker shades to states with lower proportions. Because Pew gives whole numbers for these percentages, I've broken it down like this. The darkest shade represents states where 25% or less of the population is unaffiliated. the second darkest shade where 26 to 30% are, the next lightest shade where 31 to 40% are unaffiliated, and the lightest shade states where 40% or more of the residents are not religious. In both Louisiana and Colorado, for example, the largest and second largest faith categories are evangelicals and Catholics. Religion, however, has a very different presence in the two states, as evidenced by the relative intensity of the colors. I'll take you through each of the major groups that show up on this map, explore their history within the United States, some of their major branches, how they arrived and evolved within the country, and where they're regionally most and least prevalent. For the maps I show for each of these groups, they'll be shaded to depict the percent who are unaffiliated, and stripes will show states where they're the second largest group. After all that, I'll explore the prevalence of unaffiliated Americans and Americans who practice other faiths besides Christianity, and each of those maps will show different percentages on a case-by-case basis. I know some of you are going to ask why I didn't talk about a specific religion or branch of a religion. Well, there are thousands of religions out there, and I can't get to all of them. Plus, I'm using one data set, and I'm limited by what they show. Also, odds are whatever religion or sect of a religion that you're interested in is probably encompassed by one of these groups here. With all that said, let's get to it. First, let's give a full quick breakdown of the United States. 62% of Americans are Christian, 29% are unaffiliated, 2% are Jewish, 1% each are Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist, and less than 1% follow other world religions, and about 2% practice what Pew describes as something else. Looking further at Christians, 39% of Americans, not just of American Christians, are Protestant, 19% are Catholic, 2% are Mormon, 1% Orthodox Christians, less than 1% are Jehovah's Witnesses, and another 1% are categorized by Pew as other Christians. If we look further at Protestants, 23% of Americans were grouped by Pew as Evangelical Protestants, 11% as Mainline Protestants, and 5% as historically black Protestants. We'll start off with the largest religious group in the United States, Evangelical Protestants, depicted in green on this map. Though a broad movement, evangelicals are typically distinguished by what they describe as a more individual relationship with God, and through finding their own belief, personally receiving salvation for their sins, what they call being born again. At 23% of the American population, evangelicals represent about 78 million people within the country, are the largest religious group in 32 states and 1 territory, and the second largest in additional 11 states and 3 territories. In only 7 states, DC and American Samoa, are they not one of the largest 2 groups. While pretty much every state has a substantial evangelical population, they're the largest religious group in the American South and Midwest, and the second largest group in the Northeast and West, one of the 2 largest groups in each of the 4 regions Pew divides the U.S. into. In the South, evangelical Protestants are particularly prominent. In Oklahoma, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi, they make up over 40% of the population, and in Arkansas, 50% of the state's residents are evangelical, making it the only state besides Utah where a single religious group makes up at least half of the population. Their predominance in the South matches with the region's high rates of religiosity, too. The South, particularly the Deep South, has, on top of high proportions of evangelicals, the country's lowest proportions of religiously unaffiliated people. So evangelical Protestantism is especially dominant in the region, and its high religiosity means that 52% of all American evangelicals live in the South, followed by 21% in the Midwest, 19% in the West, and just 9% in the Northeast. The most densely populated part of the country is home to the fewest evangelicals. Only in the Northeast, the Territories, the Southwest, and the western part of the Midwest do evangelicals make up a smaller proportion of the population, the smallest in Utah at 3%, 7% in DC, and 8% in Vermont and Massachusetts. If we explore further into the breakdown by denomination, there's another major difference between evangelicals in the South versus the rest of the country. Whereas in the West or the Midwest, evangelicals are more split between a variety of evangelical traditions, such as evangelical Lutherans, Pentecostalists, or non-denominational evangelicals. Throughout the South, Baptists make up often an overwhelming majority of evangelicals. The Southern Baptist Convention alone is the second largest church in the country after just the Catholic Church. The strong religiosity and the particular predominance of the Evangelical Protestant tradition in this part of the country has led many to refer to the evangelical-dominated swath of the U.S. from roughly Virginia to the Florida Panhandle to North Texas as the Bible Belt. To understand the origins of the evangelical, mainline, and historically black Protestant traditions, we're going to go back and look first at the history of Protestantism in the U.S. overall. Protestants make up the dominant religious tradition in the United States. Like I mentioned earlier, nearly half of all Americans are Protestant. The majority of American Christians, more than twice as many Americans, are Protestant than Catholic. Globally, though, this is the exception. Worldwide, Protestants are a minority of Christians, representing a third of the global Christian population, while Catholics make up just over half. Looking at some of the main regions large proportions of Americans trace their ancestry to, only sub-Saharan Africa is the only one in which a plurality of the population is Protestant. Catholicism dominates in Latin America. Christianity, let alone Protestantism, is a minority religion in Asia, and in Europe, both the birthplace of the Protestant tradition and the continent that colonized North America and sent millions of settlers and later immigrants to the United States, Protestantism is surpassed in numbers by not only Catholicism, but Orthodox Christianity as well. There, it's regionally concentrated in Northern Europe, mostly Scandinavia and the UK, while Germany and the Netherlands are split roughly between Catholics and Protestants. It's Britain, though, that is largely responsible for the dominance of the Protestant tradition in the United States. It began with the Protestant Reformation in the eastern German town of Wittenberg. A monk named Martin Luther published a document called the 95 Theses, a series of criticisms of the Catholic Church and its role as the official go-between between God and believers, instead arguing that the faithful should have a more personal relationship with God. Luther's criticism sparked a series of so-called Protestant movements across Europe, and disputes between Protestants and Catholics in the Old World would be a source of chaos, upheaval, and warfare throughout the continent, particularly as rulers in places like Britain changed the official faith of the country from Catholic to Protestant and back again, based on their own personal beliefs. This religious upheaval in Britain, Germany, and other European countries was a driving force in American colonization. Separatist Protestant groups critical of the Protestant Church of England, like the Pilgrims and Puritans, facing persecution in their homeland, fled for what would become the United States, as did a number of Catholics, other Protestants, people practicing other religions altogether, and non-religious people tired of sectarian conflicts in Europe. With large colonial settlement from heavily Protestant parts of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Netherlands, and immigration from Germany, organized religion in the early North American colonies was primarily dominated by Protestant denominations, and later immigrants from all sorts of religious backgrounds would enter into a society with a Protestant majority. By the early 1700s, though, religion was waning in importance in the American colonies. Fewer Americans attended church services, and across Europe and North America, a philosophical movement called the Enlightenment was spreading, which emphasized reason and secularism, and a thinking on individual rights that would set the stage for the American Revolution. In this atmosphere came the Great Awakening. Throughout the 1730s and 40s, charismatic preachers like Massachusetts' Jonathan Edwards and Britain's George Whitefield traveled the colonies, preaching a Christianity that emphasized a personal, direct relationship with God, and that all people are born sinners, but by seeking forgiveness and accepting God, can be saved and born again. Great Awakening preachers spurred a large increase in church attendance and membership, and their born-again Christianity became a theme across different denominations, the beginning of an evangelical movement that would remain a major aspect of American cultural life ever since. While the South had been predominantly Anglican, America's separation from Britain in the Revolutionary War made all things British increasingly taboo, including the Church of England. It waned, and as Southern settlers pushed further west into the frontiers of the Southern backcountry, it was the personal message of the evangelical movement that appealed in particular to these so-called common folk, and the movement planted deep roots in the region, especially among white settlers. An emphasis on moral discipline and of the Bible being free from error has led many evangelicals to be socially conservative. As the early 1900s brought major leaps in scientific understanding of the world and an increasingly liberalized American society, many Protestants known as modernists embraced these changes, while others known as fundamentalists opposed them. This fundamentalist-modernist split resulted in an eventual schism into two major Protestant faith groups. The more conservative fundamentalists typically carried on the evangelical tradition, while non-evangelical Protestants tended to embrace modernist views and became known as Mainline Protestants. Today, this can be seen in the political differences of the two traditions. Evangelical Protestants tend to hold more conservative political and social beliefs, while Mainline Protestants tend to be more evenly divided between conservatives, moderates, and liberals. It's important to note, though, that these are diverse movements of countless individual denominations and people, and they can't be easily put into a box. These are just more general, large-scale trends. The tradition of the charismatic Great Awakening preacher has been carried on by the evangelical movement into the modern era through large-scale services to massive congregations in enormous so-called mega-churches, or through television and radio broadcasting to international audiences by influential preachers like Billy Graham. After evangelicals, the second largest religious group in the United States is both a single church and a single branch of Christianity, Catholicism, depicted in red on this map. While Protestants tend to believe in a more personal understanding of the Bible, Catholics generally believe that religious authority lies within the structure and formal traditions of the organized Catholic Church. They tend to place greater emphasis on saints, the practices of communion and confession, and are governed by the Pope, an elected leader whom they believe to be the direct successor of Peter, a disciple of Jesus, whom they treat as the first leader of their church. 19% of Americans are Catholic, some 65 million people, including notably the global leader of the church, Pope Leo XIV, who's from Chicago. The Catholic Church is the largest single church in the country, though the evangelical movement, made up of many different denominations, is in the U.S. larger overall. Catholics make up the largest religious group in 16 different states and 3 territories, and are the second largest group in another 16 states, the other 2 territories, and the District of Columbia. It tends to predominate in the regions where evangelicals make up smaller shares of the population, the Northeast, Southwest, Caribbean, and parts of the Great Lakes. In the Northeast and the West, it's the largest religious group, and is the second largest in the South and Midwest. Though this map shows a relatively limited Catholic presence in the South, more Catholics live there than in any other of Pew's 4 regions, 29%, something that can be attributed to not only the region's high religiosity, but to the large Catholic communities in the population giants of Texas and Florida, the country's second and third most populous states, are both grouped by Pew in with the South. Another 26% of American Catholics live in the Catholic-dominated Northeast, followed by 25% in the West and 20% in the Midwest. In the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Northern Marianas, Catholicism is practiced by overwhelming proportions of the population. When Martin Luther inspired the Protestant Reformation in 1517, he defined Protestant theology by its disagreements with the dominant Catholic Church. In Europe, indeed around the world, Protestants were often a minority. But in Protestant Britain's 13 colonies, it had mostly been followers of this breakaway branch who made their home on the Atlantic coast of North America. The new United States would become an exception on the global stage, a country where Protestant Christianity would be the dominant faith. Catholics in the 13 colonies were often unwelcome, in many colonies barred from voting or practicing their faith. Maryland was founded as a colony where Catholics could live and practice in peace, but they were eventually surpassed in population there by Protestants who reversed those protections. Only Pennsylvania, founded on religious freedom, had in the colonial era a more substantial and free Catholic population. While the young United States explicitly embraced religious freedom in its constitution, Protestants made up the largest religious group. Long rooted in the country, they made up America's ruling classes, stood at the top of its social hierarchy. They were the white, English-speaking settlers who often settled the American frontier, people whose ancestors came from England, Scotland, Germany, and Northern Ireland, populations that had been long settled in the country at the eve of its independence. Even the acronym WASP, a term used today to broadly refer to the country's established upper social classes, refers to them, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. These old stock Protestants were seen as more generally American, whereas Catholics, many of whom immigrated in the major immigration waves of the 1800s, were seen as others. Even today, though America has long had a huge Catholic population, today some 1 in 5 Americans, only 2 presidents have ever been Catholic, John F. Kennedy and Joe Biden, compared to 37 who have been Protestant. For immigrant groups from Catholic majority countries like Italy, Poland, and Ireland, who flocked to the country through northeastern ports like New York, Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, Catholicism was a way to remain connected to their ancestral heritage, as well as a way in which they were deemed outsiders by others in the country. Many immigrants who came from heavily Catholic Southern and Eastern Europe sought out jobs and new lives in the major cities of the Northeast and industrial Midwest. In America, Catholicism became an urban religion, one strongly tied to immigrant communities in the cities of the Northeast. But Protestant Britain had not been the only European power to colonize North America. The other 2 major colonial powers on the continent, France and Spain, were strongly Catholic, and as the United States pushed west, it began to encompass existing Catholic populations. Catholicism has been deeply rooted in the old French colony of Louisiana, the Louisiana Creole people, descendants of Louisianans who have been in the state since the colonial era and often trace their ancestry to West Africa, Spain, France, and Native Americans, are typically Catholic, a legacy of French colonial rule. Cajuns, the bayou-dwelling descendants of displaced refugees from French Acadia, now Canada's maritime provinces, are often, like their French ancestors, Catholic as well. And today, southern Louisiana, with its large Cajun and Creole populations, is majority Catholic, while northern Louisiana is majority Protestant. In old Spanish colonial lands like California, Texas, and New Mexico, the Catholic Spanish Empire had mostly carried out their colonial project through the use of missions, converting, often forcibly, native people to Catholicism. In the Northeast, huge immigration waves brought immigrants from majority Catholic countries like Ireland, Poland, and Italy into major East Coast cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Massachusetts gained a large Irish population, New York and neighboring New Jersey and Connecticut, a major Italian community. Portuguese immigrants moved to Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and French Canadians settled across the border in northern New England, joining descendants of French Acadians who never left. Many immigrants from Eastern Europe went further inland to industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Milwaukee. In more recent decades, immigration from Latin America has brought more Catholic communities to the country. The Spanish-speaking world is, due to Spanish colonialism, overwhelmingly Catholic. The American territory of Puerto Rico is deeply Catholic, as are 2 other U.S. territories formerly colonized by Spain, the non-Spanish-speaking Guam and Northern Marianas. Many Puerto Ricans have moved stateside to Florida and New York, joining a large Dominican community in New York City and Cuban community in Florida. The country that nearly a quarter of new Americans moved to the U.S. from, though, is Mexico. The U.S.'s southern neighbor is majority Catholic, and in Mexican-American communities in Southern California and the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, Catholicism predominates. It's the largest religious group in California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Florida, as well as Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire. The next 2 religious groups I'll go over are both Protestant. First, we have the Mainline Protestants, depicted in blue on this map. Though the 3rd largest religious group in the country, representing 11% of all Americans, Mainline Protestants make up the largest religious group in only 3 states, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Iowa, as well as in the territory of American Samoa. They make up the 2nd largest religious group, though, in much of the Northeast, Great Plains, and Upland South. Despite not making up the largest group in a single southern state, most Mainline Protestants, 37%, live in the South, which goes to show just how religious the region is in comparison to the rest of the country. An additional 28% live in the Midwest, followed by 18% and 17%, respectively, in the West and Northeast. They're the 3rd largest religious group in each of these regions, making up their largest share of the regional population at 16% in the Midwest and the smallest, 9%, in the West. Mainline Protestants are, like evangelicals, a broad religious grouping that takes into account many Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Methodists, and other Protestant churches. Many churches that consider themselves to be the same denomination can be seen as either evangelical or mainline. Many Baptist churches, for example, are evangelical, while others follow a more mainline tradition. Remember the fundamentalist modernist split I talked about earlier in American Protestantism? The churches that took a more modernist approach are generally what we consider today to follow the mainline tradition. While evangelicals typically believe the Bible to be without error, some followers of mainline churches consider a text more open to interpretation. Mainline Protestants are typically less concerned with converting non-Christians. They may believe in evolution or support gay marriage. This is not to say these more modernist views can't be found among followers of other Christian traditions. Indeed, there are many evangelicals and Catholics who share these opinions and many mainline Protestants who don't. Just that the modernist take on Christianity is far more mainstream among mainline congregations than in others. Indeed, mainline Protestants report having a fairly even mix of liberal, moderate, and conservative political views, while evangelicals skew more conservative. Now the country's third largest religious group, mainline Protestantism was once dominant in American society and culture. As recently as 1960, some half of all Americans belonged to mainline churches, the branch of Christianity that many British colonists to the New World belonged to. The Episcopal Church, for example, is the American version of the Church of England. In the South, particularly upland states like North Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee, Scots-Irish settlers from Northern Ireland settled in mountain regions, bringing with them their Presbyterian faith. In the upper Midwest, later immigrants from Germany, Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands brought the Lutheran and Dutch Reformed traditions to the New World, making states like Minnesota, Iowa, and North Dakota plurality mainline. In recent decades, mainline churches have faced shrinking numbers. Churches have struggled across the board in keeping young people in attendance, while at the same time the fast-growing evangelical movement has appealed to many former mainline Protestants. Indeed, many conservative congregations have split from their larger, more liberal or moderate denominations and moved towards a more evangelical approach. This brings us to the fourth of our 5 main religious groups, and the final Protestant group we'll touch on today: historically black Protestants. 5% of Americans, some 17 million people, belong to what's often called the Black Church. The tradition of black churches, such as the African Methodist Episcopal or AME Church, is an old one in the United States, and black Americans are overwhelmingly Protestant, 66% compared to just 6% who are Catholic. Now, some 13% of Americans are black, 2/3 of whom are Protestant, totaling more than 8% of Americans. This smaller figure, 5%, is because we're not talking about all black Protestants, just Americans who attend predominantly black congregations. I mean, according to Pew, small percentages of these congregations are white and Hispanic. Serving for centuries a group of Americans who were cut off from mainstream American society, treated like second-class citizens, these historically black Protestant churches have a different history and develop different practices and at times religious beliefs from their mainline and evangelical Protestant counterparts. Historically black Protestants are the largest religious group in just one state, Maryland, where they're tied for first with evangelicals, as well as in the District of Columbia, and are the second largest group after evangelicals in 4 Deep South states: Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, each among the states with the largest proportions of black residents. It's the 4th largest religious group in each of the regions save for the West, where it's 5th, surpassed by Mormons. Historically black Protestants are regionally very concentrated in the South, where they make up 9% of the strongly religious region's population, compared to just 2% in the West. Overall, 64% of all historically black Protestants live in the American South, followed by 15% in the Midwest, 13% in the Northeast, and just 7% in the West. Most black Americans are descendants of people who have lived in the country for generations, and as such, it is an old and historic American religious tradition. It is born from an early American Protestantism, brought to the New World by European colonists, incorporating traditional religious hymns and practices from West Africa, where many enslaved people were brought to the U.S. from. Though many of the first black churches were founded by free black Americans, black Christianity was alive even among the confines of slavery. For many enslaved people, religion was a place of some hope and solace during the horrific ordeals of enslavement. It was often practiced in secret, stories like Exodus, of a people freed from slavery, a place of faith. After the end of slavery, religious life, particularly in the South where most black Americans lived, was often segregated. The church became not just a religious center, but the center of community life. Excluded from many community organizations, written out of government programs, churches were centers of mutual aid and community support. Preaching a theology rooted in ideals of freedom and liberation, it was through black churches that much of the civil rights movement was organized, and the most famous preacher in the black Protestant church is, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. The last of the 5 religious groups that make up either the largest or second largest group in a state are the Latter-day Saints, better known as Mormons. Though some members reject the term Mormon, which comes from one of the church's central religious texts, the Book of Mormon, many are comfortable with the term, which is what members of the church are more commonly known as nationwide. The Mormon movement has splintered over time, and other churches have formed following Mormon teachings, like the Community of Christ, but with 96% of self-described Mormons belonging to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS Church, the two are almost synonymous. Like historically black Protestants, Mormons are a religious group that is very much concentrated regionally. 69% of American Mormons, nearly 3/4, live in the American West. An additional 19% live in the South, with just 7 and 5% in the Midwest and Northeast, respectively. They make up just 1% or fewer of the regional populations of the Northeast, Midwest, and South, while 4% of people in the American West are Mormon. Mormons are very heavily concentrated in Utah. Some 61% of all American Mormons live in the state, but that leaves an additional 8% throughout other parts of the American West. Places like Idaho, Nevada, Wyoming, and Arizona have pretty significant LDS populations, and even in coastal states like California and Washington, Latter-day Saint communities are far larger than in New York or Illinois. West of the Rockies, the LDS Church just has much more of a presence. Even Hawaii and Alaska have fairly large Mormon populations. Mormonism is a religious tradition born of the Second Great Awakening. It is a Christian faith, though one very distinct from Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox Christianity, building on it with a number of other texts, including the Book of Mormon, which tells a story of ancient Hebrew tribes they believe once migrated to the Americas. Members of the LDS Church follow the teachings of the church's founder, Joseph Smith, whom they consider to be a prophet, and believe the church to be a restored version of an old, lost church. Mormons also bring with them a shared history that has led them to be so heavily concentrated in Utah and the American West. Joseph Smith and his first followers were from upstate New York, but as the church gained a larger and larger following, it came to be perceived by some as a threat. At times this stemmed from the practice of polygamy, which some members practiced, or fears about anti-democratic practices being put into place in majority Mormon towns. At times it was just fear or hatred of religious views different from mainstream Christianity. But Smith and his followers were driven, at times violently, out of each place they lived, to Missouri and then to Illinois, where Smith was arrested and while in prison, killed at the hands of a violent mob. From there, the church and its members, under the leadership of a man named Brigham Young, fled west, out of the country altogether, into what was then Mexico. Settling in the valley of the Great Salt Lake, a land they would call Deseret, this new Mormon territory would quickly change hands from Mexico to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War, where it would be named Utah. After a power struggle with the U.S. government called the Utah War, the church took a more mainstream path, abandoning polygamy. Mormons and the European converts who joined them from places like England and Scandinavia were among the first white settlers to really attempt to live in the arid Mountain West. They likely learned desert irrigation techniques from the Native Americans of the region, and harnessed irrigation to channel water flowing out of Utah's snow-capped peaks and turn otherwise dry flatlands into agriculturally productive farmland. With a mastery of irrigation that later Western settlers and even the federal government would eventually adopt, Mormon communities quickly spread throughout Utah and into neighboring states like Idaho, Nevada, Wyoming, and Arizona. Today, there is just one state in the country where Mormons make up the largest religious group, Utah, and just one more where they are the second largest religious group, Idaho. 50% of Utah's population is Mormon, but outside of the Beehive State's large Mormon community, the rest of Utah's population is not particularly religious. It has a fairly large unaffiliated population at 34%, and the state's next largest religious group, Mainline Protestants, make up just 5% of Utah's population, a very small proportion. At 14%, Idaho has the country's next largest Latter-day Saint population, and is the only other state where LDS church members make up greater than 10% of the population. Mormons in Idaho are not evenly distributed throughout the state, most living in a corridor stretching directly north from Utah to the Montana border. Western and northern Idaho are much like the rest of the American West, with a small but notable Mormon minority, while much of eastern Idaho is majority Mormon. Latter-day Saints make up a majority of the Pocatello and Idaho Falls metro areas, and a quarter of the population of the Twin Falls area. On the other hand, the southwestern and northern cities of Boise and Coeur d'Alene have significantly smaller LDS populations, at about 16 and 6% respectively. Now, having gone through these 5 groups, I still haven't covered the largest religious group in the country, the religiously unaffiliated, who make up 29% of all Americans, a larger share than any of the groups we've covered so far. Pew breaks them up into atheists, people who believe there is no God, agnostics, people who don't know if there is a God, and the largest share of the unaffiliated, those who just say they don't practice any religion in particular. Religiously unaffiliated people are fairly evenly spread throughout the country. 33% live in the South, 28% in the West, 21% in the Midwest, and 18% in the Northeast. 30% of both the Midwest and Northeast are unaffiliated, 35% of the West is, and 25% of the South is. Simply put, the Western U.S. is generally the least religious part of the country, while the South is the most religious. While the map on the thumbnail depicts the proportion of unaffiliated people by showing lighter shades of each color, I've also made a map just showing proportions of unaffiliated Americans. As you can see, the Mountain West, West Coast, and New England states are generally the least religious parts of the country, whereas the South, Great Plains, and the Territories are generally the most religious. In every state in New England, as well as every state west of the Rockies, save for New Mexico, at least 31% of the population is unaffiliated. The country's least religious states are Oregon, Colorado, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Vermont itself is the country's least religious state. 46% of Vermonters are unaffiliated, surpassing the 45% who are Christian, the total of each of the Christian groups we've covered so far. While people who practice other faiths outside Christianity make religious people still a slight majority in Vermont, the Green Mountain State has more non-religious people than people who practice Christianity. Like each of the groups we've covered so far, the religiously unaffiliated have a long history in the United States. Though today we're often told a story of an America that was deeply Christian at its founding, this could not be further from the truth. In fact, the country's birth was in all likelihood its least religious moment. Many people fled to colonial America to escape the religious wars and persecution of Europe, and unsurprisingly, life in these colonies was quite attractive to those who practiced no religion at all. Besides, the American Revolution was born out of the ideas of the Enlightenment, in some cases questioning religion altogether, but at the very least prioritizing religious freedom, not just the right to practice any religion you choose, but the right to choose not to practice one at all. In fact, it's estimated that around the Revolution, anywhere from 70 to 90% of Europeans in the 13 colonies were not church members, at the very least twice the unaffiliated population in the U.S. today. Some argue that many of the founding fathers, most notably Thomas Jefferson, were strongly influenced by, if not believers in, a system called deism, the belief that there is a God who created but does not and never has interfered in the universe. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, though, religious life in America boomed with the Second Great Awakening. New congregations sprung up left and right in a period of deep religious fervor, and many unaffiliated Americans converted to Christianity, making it the dominant faith it has been in the country for much of American history. In recent years, the ranks of religiously unaffiliated Americans have been rising quite rapidly. When I began making this video using data from 2014, unaffiliated Americans made up 22.8% of the country's population, a smaller share than evangelicals. With Pew's updated data, they've risen to 29%, now a larger share than any of the aforementioned religious groups. I even had to update the parameters by which I shaded states between the two maps, because so many states had since become a shade more unaffiliated. This is mostly attributed to people who were raised religious no longer identifying with their faith in adulthood, and has been a trend throughout North America, Europe, and Latin America. Every religious group I've talked about so far represents a smaller share of the population than they did in 2014, save for Mormons, while Mainline Protestants saw the sharpest decline from 15 to 11% of the U.S. population. Finally, let's look at other faiths. Christianity is, looking back through history, among the newer religions to have reached the North American continent. Native Americans long practiced their own religions. Ancient cities like Cahokia, with its temples and pyramid mounds, are thought to have been centers of religious life. Native religions were often unique to each tribe, but a number believed in a monotheistic Great Spirit whose presence inhabits all things. In the early United States, it's thought that as many as 30% of all enslaved Africans brought to the country or its predecessor colonies were Muslim, most forced to give up their old faith in the new land, though some maintained it. Additionally, by 1800, there were Jewish congregations in New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and the Virgin Islands. Most followers of non-Christian faiths, however, came to the U.S. in later immigration waves. Some 2.5 million Jews came to the U.S. during the mass European immigration wave of the late 1800s and early 1900s, mostly from Eastern Europe. In the later half of the 1900s, immigrants from other parts of the world brought with them other faiths. Of these other religions, the largest is Judaism, which about 2% of Americans practice, followed by Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Unitarianism, and New Age faiths. Pew considers Unitarianism a separate religion from Christianity, though this is a matter of debate. Some Unitarians consider themselves Christian, while others consider it to be a separate faith. On my main map, I showed states where believers in other faiths make up more than 10% of the population by depicting its shading in dots instead of stripes. This map shows those same states in dark shades of pink, as well as states where at least 5% of the population practices another faith in lighter shades of pink. There are 32 states in the country, as well as D.C. and the Northern Mariana Islands, where 5% or more of the population practices a religion besides Christianity, including the entire East and West coasts and significant parts of the Midwest and Mountain West. In 7 states, as well as the Northern Marianas, more than 10% of the population practices another religion. These states are primarily in the western U.S., Washington, Oregon, and Arizona, and the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Only in the Northern Marianas, with its significant Buddhist population, does a single religion make up that 10%. In the others, it's typically a combination of these other faiths. In Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York, the largest of these non-Christian faiths is Judaism. In Connecticut, it's Islam. In Washington, it's Buddhism. In Oregon, it's Unitarianism. And in Arizona, it's a tie between Hinduism, Buddhism, and Unitarianism, each at 2%. This was a broad overview of the major religious groups in the United States. If you want to learn more, I definitely recommend you check out Pew's Religious Landscape Study. I'll link it in the description. If you like this video and want to learn more about the history of the U.S. through maps and the major cultural groups in the country, I also have a video diving into the major ancestry groups in the country, which I think you'll enjoy. I also recommend checking out my 2-part series discussing the major regions of the country. And of course, if you haven't yet discovered the U.S. Explained, I think you'll absolutely love it. It's my Keystone series, profiling every state, territory, and federal district in the country by order of admission, a journey through American history, culture, and physical geography. I'm currently about halfway through the series, so there is plenty out there to watch. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing to the channel, sharing this video with your friends, or checking out some of my other work. I think there's a lot you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.